Good morning, everybody. I'm very excited to be talking to you today about equity in education. I'd like to talk about building a equity in education toolbox. And my equity in education toolbox also contains a literacy toolbox. So I came across this because in my family we like to build. My dad makes this beautiful furniture, and my brother builds, he installs glass in commercial buildings, and my family were always working on something. And when I was a kid, my dad gave me this small screwdriver set that his grandfather had passed along to him, and he thought it was important to start me off in filling my toolbox with what I needed to build my own stuff. So my dad taught me that having the right tools for the job helps you do any job effectively. And I still love to build things. But what I build now is confidence, patience, and I build a passion for reading. I have a different kind of toolbox in order to do that. One that I use to help build successful students. I teach my students how to manipulate the nuts and bolts of language, how to tighten those nuts and bolts together, and they make sense of words out of them, out of the written word. Phonology, morphology, word origin, those are the nuts and bolts. Those are the sounds and the meanings and where those words come from. They help my students make sense of the written word. Now, I knew early on I wanted to be a teacher. I'm the oldest of three, and I vividly remember trying to help my brothers practice reading their stories for homework, and they would get so frustrated and so angry. And my one brother, one time, he was sitting there and he was trying to sound out words. He was trying to do this. And he just got so mad, he flung the book across the room and he was yelling, and I can't do this. And he was such a smart kid, but the words on the page didn't make sense to him and he thought he was dumb. I wanted so desperately to help him make sense of those words. I felt his anger and I saw the frustration on his face, and I needed so much to know what to do to help him be successful. But my teacher toolbox was not filled enough to know what to do because I was just a young kid. Dyslexia was what they called it. He ended up in this classroom and he found these amazing teachers who got him the right kind of help to learn how to read. He came across these teachers who knew Orton Gillingham, and they taught him the nuts and bolts of reading in a way that nobody else really could. Those teachers provided him a literacy toolbox, and that was the equity that they needed to level the playing field of reading. My brother needed more than a language-rich environment. He needed a structured method to tighten the nuts and bolts of phonology, morphology, and the origins of words. Now, I believe the universe puts you exactly where you need to be, and it was that empty toolbox that I had that spurred me to learn what I could to help others be successful. I had to find the right tool, like my dad taught me, in order to do the job. It ignited my passion to fill my teacher toolbox and level that playing field for my students, to provide the equity that filled my students' toolbox. 1 in 5. Think of the students in your classroom. For every 5 students, 1 of them is going to experience the empty toolbox that my brother experienced. And when you throw socioeconomic factors into it, that number doubles. Structured literacy is a very helpful tool for me to provide my struggling students with the right tools for their toolbox. I thought about the different factors in equity when I was creating this talk. There's social status, there's culture, there's economics. What cuts across all of them and what levels the playing field for kids is building language skills, the concept that they can communicate in not just orally, but in the written word effectively. How can you do that, though? One way that I have seen with experience that has helped me is using structured literacy in the classroom in a one-on-one environment. It's a great method to help kids. Now I can help fill my students' toolbox to help them tighten those nuts and bolts of language effectively in their mind. I found that using structured literacy not only does that, it empowers my students. Like a suit of armor it puts on them, as I have heard my mentors tell me. There's a great deal of research out there by Marianne Wolf, and Stanislas Dehaene and many others that provide evidence that show while language is innate, the ability to learn language, the ability to speak, it's innate and it's hardwired into our brains. We listen to the adults around us when we're babies. We pick up language, and the more we speak as a young child, the more you speak to young children, the more you read to young children, the better off they are. But reading itself is not an innate skill. It has to be directly taught. Marianne Wolf talks about how reading needs to be created through a reading circuit. Every reader has to create their own reading circuit, and it's repurposed from other parts of the brain that we used when we were hunter-gatherers. So those nuts and bolts of language, the sounds, the morphology, the origin, the pieces that make up its structure, they can be taught. We know from functional MRI studies that the structure literacy concepts, they change the brain structure closer to patterns that are seen in average readers. So a student, when they do these functional MRI studies, they have different brain patterns. And then when they go through mentoring and tutoring of structured literacy, and it actually changes the brain so that they're more of an average reader. We have decades of research to understand more about the variations in the brain that cause sounds to be elusive for 1 out of every 5 students. But we have students who come to us frustrated by a system that doesn't understand them, and they think it's a failure within themselves. And we have this push now for early identification, and it's really great that we get these K through 2 students and we can identify them and we can get them on the right track for the most part in a lot of districts. But there are older students that are out there right now in 4th grade and up, and they need our help. They need these tools. It's not their fault that they don't have the right tools. Anna Gillingham says that it doesn't really matter how a child got to be the way he is. It's our job as teachers to make him successful in school. Every boy and girl has the right to be given what they need to be successful, regardless of the challenges that they come across. Now, I once started working with this 8th grade student at the end of the school year. He was one of the hardest working young men that I've ever encountered. His passion was baseball, and he would get up at 5 a.m. to practice pitching. But he was very frustrated, and he felt demoralized because of his lack of reading skills. My goal with students, when I work with them, is to get them to hear 5 sounds in a word. In English, there's usually, in a 1-syllable word, the most that you would have is 5 sounds. Any more than that, you could break it into other syllables. So we teach our students to be able to hear those 5 sounds. That's the goal. He could only break down 2 sounds. So he could tell me the sounds in a word like say, but beyond that, he had a very hard time being able to break anything down. So he came to me in 8th grade and he couldn't even tell me what a short vowel sound was. He had no concept of a or I, or he had a hard time hearing these things. So we would practice, and we had to put time and effort in order to become a better reader. Now, I tell my students all the time that anything that's worth it is never easy. And in the beginning, he fought me because he didn't think that he didn't want to do the work that was required for this structured literacy, because we actually do a lot of motor memory things. And so I turned to him and I asked him, I said, were you always a good pitcher? And he says, no, I wasn't always a good pitcher. I had to work really hard at it. I get up and I had to do a lot of practice in order to do it. And I smiled at him. And then he smiled back at me. And he says, oh, okay, yeah, all right, you got me. I get it. And that's when he understood what I was trying to say. And I saw him in a one-on-one environment. So this is the thing that I think a lot of districts have a hard time wrapping themselves around, because it's expensive. And in our current economy, it gets very hard for districts to spend the money. But we have to understand that equity doesn't mean that everyone gets the same. Equity means that everyone gets what they need to be successful. This student needed the structured literacy in a one-on-one environment to help him be successful. So I explained to him, just like when he practices his pitching, that motor memory is the strongest memory that we have when we learn. And we were harnessing that to help his mind hold on to those sounds in English. So mid-year in 9th grade, I asked him to spell the word stretch. S-T-R-E-T-C-H. Stretch. It's a word with 5 sounds. And he went through the motions, he put down the word, and it was so beautiful. But then he turns to me and he says, "Miss Corina, until I met you, I would have never known how to spell that word." And I still get emotional thinking about it. But that right there, that's equity. That young man, that really talented baseball player, he now has the tools in his literacy toolbox in order for him to see how intelligent he is, and in order for him to be able to be better with his academics. There's a philosophy in the Akan tribe in Ghana called Sankofa. It means that you need to reflect on the past in order to build a successful future. And I thought about my experiences in education as I was reading this Forward Together study. It's a study that was done by the National Center for Learning Disabilities and Understood.org. And they found that only 30% of the general education teachers feel strongly about successfully teaching students with learning disabilities, and only half of them believe that the students that they teach can reach grade level standards. These findings show that public K-12 teachers across the nation consider themselves ill-equipped to teach the students that they are in charge of. And they still hold on these outdated misconceptions about student learning and attention issues. How is it that an educational system how can an educational system provide equity to students when the frontline providers don't feel equipped to teach them, and they carry these outdated and old ideals about them? As I read through this study, I thought back about my early days as a teacher. I didn't appreciate that there was so much that I didn't know. And I started teaching in 1999. I taught myself as much as I could about multisensory learning techniques, but my educational training didn't really prepare me. I learned about closed reading passages. Those of you who have taught as long as I have, you'll remember what a closed reading passage is. And it took me about 15 years of searching until I found the right kind of program, this structured literacy program. Structured literacy is a little bit more of a modern term that's used. And I often say that I wish that I had the training that I got sooner. I went to a place called the Children's Dyslexia Center, and it was like boot camp I call it boot camp for teaching reading, but it really taught me the nuts and bolts of reading. And the training that I received taught me that these reading challenged students, those 1 in 5, can be successful. And what I've also found is that when I talk about these concepts in an inclusion classroom with the general ed teachers, they are so excited about the things that I talk about. And they're like, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. And when you start explaining to all these kids, they light up, and the light bulb goes on for them, and they're so excited by it. And in this Forward Together study, there were 8 key practices that were shown to be effective in the general education classroom that improve achievement for not just the 1 in 5 students, but for the general education population as well. Out of those 8 practices, 3 of them spoke directly to structured literacy. So structured literacy is explicit targeted instruction, strategy instruction, and it's evidence-based content instruction. Structured literacy is a great tool for teachers because it is explicit and targeted instruction. It alleviates this cognitive demand that kids have on guessing what their expectations are. They don't have to figure anything out. They can focus on mastering the expectations. It incorporates strategy instruction, which we all know is so important. To have kids need quick strategies that they can do, and it provides students with skills so that they're self-sufficient in their own learning. It's evidence-based instruction because it's based on multisensory explicit instruction that we now know and have the research behind us to know that it teaches the right way and it teaches in a sequential manner. Structured literacy, overall, it's an important tool that helps me provide the equity to the students that I work with. And just as my dad passed his tools along to me, I am passing this tool along to you. This knowledge that structured literacy belongs in our educator literacy toolbox. It belongs in our equity